A lesson can be perfectly planned and still fail half the room. We haven't fully thought about how that lesson will actually be experienced in the room. Because teaching doesn't happen on paper, it happens in the interaction. At its simplest, orchestration is this: pausing and asking better questions about what your plan will create. Every plan creates both opportunities and pressure points. What looks smooth on paper can feel very different when experienced by 30 different learners. Every lesson contains the seeds of its own success and its own failure. We are designing experiences before it does. We're designing success. That's the moment teaching becomes precise. Because great teaching isn't just planned, it's orchestrated. A lesson can be perfectly planned and still fail half the room. I'll break this down. And if you want to jump into sections, timings are coming up now. You can jump to any section, and the full orchestration checklist is at the end. Have you ever taught a lesson that was perfectly planned, clear objectives, strong content, well sequenced, and yet somehow it just didn't land? Some students got it, some drifted, some resisted. And you're left thinking, what went wrong? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most lessons don't fail in the planning. They fail in what happens next. They fail in the orchestration. The plan is not the lesson. It's only the starting point. And this is something I see again and again. Really well-designed lessons that just don't quite land for a significant number of students. Not because the content is wrong, not because the teacher isn't skilled, but because we haven't fully thought about how that lesson will actually be experienced in the room. Because teaching doesn't happen on paper, it happens in the interaction. So in this episode, I want to break that down in a way that's really practical. We're going to start by looking at what orchestration actually is and why a well-planned lesson can still miss the room. Then I'll walk you through a simple shift you can make in just 10 minutes before a lesson that helps you anticipate where things might go wrong and where they might really work. From there, we'll apply that key thinking to moments of teaching such as transitions, modeling, questioning, guided practice and review. And notice how small changes can completely change the way that lesson can land. We'll then zoom out and look at curriculum implementation, quality assurance, and really deal with how it is that different students can experience the same lesson differently, and how understanding what sits behind behavior allows us to become far more precise. Because the real shift is this: not just where might this go wrong, but for whom will this go wrong and why. And that's where teaching moves from good to genuinely precise. At its simplest, orchestration is this: pausing and asking better questions about what your plan will create. Not rewriting it, not adding more, just pressure testing it. Every plan creates both opportunities and pressure points. What looks smooth on paper can feel very different when experienced by 30 different learners. Mary Myatt talks about the difference between activity and understanding. A lesson can look productive without actually landing. And if we take John Hattie's work, the question is always about impact, not intent. Impact lives in the experience, not the plan. In many cases, this is just 10 minutes before the lesson. Where are the pressure points? Where might students hesitate? Where might this lose the room? Because every lesson works perfectly until it meets a real class. Pause, predict, adapt. We should never underestimate the power of routines. When routines are strong, a lot of the orchestration is already done. Routines create the conditions for everything else to work. They create predictability, and that's stabilizing. It reduces uncertainty, reduces cognitive load, and for many students, particularly those who struggle with regulation, that's what allows them to engage. Predictability doesn't restrict learning, it stabilizes it. Take something like the students entering the classroom, meet and greet, fantastic relationally, but orchestration asks more. What are the first students doing while I'm still at the door? Because the reality is, those first few students enter and you're still more or less outside. So, what do they see? What do they do? What do they start with? Is there a task already on the board? Is there something on the desk? Is it immediately accessible without you explaining it? For example, a short retrieval task, a sentence to complete, a worked example to annotate, a question that links directly to prior learning. And importantly, is it unavoidable, not optional, not start if you like, but something that pulls them in straight away? And while that's happening, how are you still scanning the room? Who's on task? Who's hesitating? Who needs a quiet nudge? If the first minute isn't orchestrated, the lesson is already behind. And this doesn't just apply to entering the room. Think about the transition from modeling and teacher exposition to guided practice. You explain, you model, and then you say, right, off you go. But orchestration asks, what happens in that exact moment? Do students know exactly what to do first, or do they pause, look around, and drift? So instead, you might say, first line only, everyone writes this sentence, pause, check, then release further. Because that transition is another pressure point. When we model, it's easy to think, I've explained that clearly. But orchestration asks, what are students actually seeing? For example, if you're modeling a paragraph, are you just showing the finished version, or are you narrating the thinking behind it? This is where I'm choosing this word. I'm linking back to the question here. I'm avoiding this common mistake, because without that, students see the outcome, but not the process. Another example, in maths, you solve the problem, but you skip the hesitation. You skip the decision point. So students think that looked easy, but they don't see the thinking behind it. If the thinking stays hidden, the learning stays fragile. Questioning isn't just about the quality of the question. It's about the experience of being questioned. So ask yourself, who am I asking and in what order? Is it always the same hands up, or are you deliberately bringing others in? For example, you might say, I'm going to come to you in a moment, just have a think. Now that student prepares. You've reduced the risk. Or you circulate first, you check the answers they're preparing quietly, then you bring them in knowing they will be successful. So when they speak, they are successful, and that's the experience they have. What happens when students get it wrong? Is that a moment of exposure or a moment of learning? How will you make sure of that? Do you say, not quite, let's build that together, or simply move on quickly? If thinking isn't distributed, learning isn't either. With guided practice, this is where lessons often begin to quietly drift, because now students are supposedly working independently, and some will start immediately, some will hesitate. Some will appear busy, but actually be unsure. So orchestration asks, who's likely to struggle silently? How do I catch that early? For example, instead of saying complete questions 1 to 5, you might say, everyone start with question 1. I'm coming round to see how you're getting on. You now control the entry and release points. You circulate immediately. You identify who's confident, who's unsure, who hasn't started. And crucially, you engineer early success. You might say quietly, "Yes, that's exactly right. Stick with that." And then return later. "Can you explain that to the class?" Now success is visible. Students don't disengage because work is hard. They disengage when success feels uncertain. For the review isn't just any questions or recapping the lesson. It's securing the learning so it actually sticks. It's asking, does that actually make sense? You might cold call a number of students. You might ask for a written summary, use mini whiteboards, or ask, what's the one thing you're taking away? Because otherwise, students leave with partial understanding, or worse, misunderstanding. And that compounds over time. If we don't secure the learning, the lesson hasn't really happened. So, across all of these moments, transitions, modeling, questioning, guided practice, and review, each one contains a potential pressure point or a point of success. Now, the way that we respond to those and the solutions will be varied, bountiful, in fact. What is really critical is that you have asked and challenged yourself, just briefly before the lesson, how am I going to overcome the potential hurdles? How am I going to maximize those moments where they really have been successful? Every lesson contains the seeds of its own success and its own failure. And orchestration is about seeing those in advance. And the more precisely we see those moments, the less we lead to chance. Behaviour is the last chapter, not the first. Behaviour is often where our attention goes first, calling out, not starting work, avoiding eye contact, distracting others. And it's very easy to respond at that level. But orchestration asks us to go one layer deeper. What happened before that behaviour? What did the student experience in the lesson that led to that moment? For example, a student calls out. We might read that as defiance. But what if they didn't fully understand? And what if not understanding the task meant they didn't want to admit that? Or a student doesn't start? We might see disengagement, but what if they don't know how to begin and they don't believe they'll get it right anyway? Or a student distracts others? We might see disruption. But what if they're trying to shift attention away from themselves as they fear failure? This aligns closely with Ben Sacco's work, the idea that behavior is a signal, not simply something to be corrected. If we misread the signal, we mistime the response. But if we respond to the surface, we often escalate what sits underneath. However, if we understand the signal, we can respond with precision. Students don't just respond to the task. They respond to what the task means about them, about their ability, about whether they belong. Deci and Ryan's work helps us understand this. Students are constantly responding to whether they feel competent, connected, and in control of what's going on. So take a simple example. You ask a student to answer a question. On the surface, it's just a question. But for that student, it might mean if I get this wrong, everyone will see. So they avoid, or say, I don't know, or disengage. Not because they don't care, but because the meaning of that moment feels risky. Students don't just respond to the task, they respond to what it means about them. Another example, a piece of extended writing. Some students start immediately. Others stall, not because they can't do it, but because it wouldn't be good enough, whatever they do. Or, I always get this wrong. Avoidance is often protection, not defiance. So now orchestration changes. We reduce the risk, we build early success, we make the path clearer because we're not just designing work, we're designing experience. Professor Amanda Kirby's work really sharpens this further with neurodiverse pupils because it highlights the variability in how students process information, organize their thinking, sustain attention, manage working memory, and how those differences shape how a lesson is actually experienced. So take a classroom example. You give a set of instructions, clear, concise, well explained. Some students start immediately. Others pause. Others look unsure. Others start but drift. Now, it's easy to say they weren't listening, but orchestration asks, what did that instruction actually require? Holding multiple steps in mind? Processing language quickly? Switching attention? Planning an approach? Because for some students, that's a much heavier load than others. The issue isn't attention in isolation. It's the interaction between the learner and the environment we've created. A second example, think about task length. You set 10 questions. Some students work steadily, others fade halfway through. Now, we might say they've lost focus, but orchestration asks, was the task chunked? Were there stopping points? Was there feedback along the way? Or was it one long stretch of uncertainty for the learners? Practitioners like Andy McDonnell remind us behaviour is communication. It reflects the interaction between the student and their environment. And Sue Atkins highlights how strongly behaviour is shaped through relationships, modelling, and emotional experience. Take a student with ADHD. We often say they can't focus, but that's the outcome, not the interaction. Instead, ask, what in this lesson supports focus? What makes it harder? Are transitions tight? Are instructions chunked? Is modelling explicit? Are practice cycles short? Are we genuinely reducing load or are we increasing it? The lesson didn't fail because the student couldn't focus. It failed because the orchestration didn't support focus. So across all of this, behaviour, motivation, neurodiversity, what we start to see is this. The same lesson creates very different experiences for each of those types of student. The same lesson, different experience, different outcome. And that's what leads us to the most important shift. For whom will this go wrong and why? That's where attribute-driven orchestration reaches the top level. And this is where it becomes really practical. Because if we understood those drivers, we wouldn't be just responding differently, we would be planning differently. Insight doesn't just change how we respond, it changes what we design. At an individual level, take a student with high hopelessness or low self-efficacy. On paper, they might look passive, disengaged, reluctant. But what we know is this. For that student, the barrier isn't the work, it's the expectation of failure. So now orchestration changes, not in a dramatic way, but in a precise way. We give fair notice when we're going to give them tasks. I'm going to come to you in a moment. Just have a think. Now they prepare safely. We circulate early. We look at their work, capturing moments of success. We don't just check it, we secure it. We might adjust it slightly, refine it, confirm, yes, that's exactly right. And then later we return to them. Now we're not just asking a risky question, we're inviting a successful contribution. We're not catching them out, we're setting them up for success. And more than that, we're engineering that success. We're noticing it, naming it, storing it. So when we come back later, we can say, talk me through what you did there, and they can succeed. Confidence isn't built in the moment, it's built in the preparation of those moments. And without that understanding, we might ask the same question in the same way and get a completely different outcome. The same question, different student, completely different risk. At a class level, we now zoom out. Imagine a class where self-efficacy is low, avoidance is high, social comparison is strong. This is a very different classroom dynamic. Not loud, not chaotic, but quietly fragile. Students hesitate, they wait, they look sideways, they avoid risk. So now orchestration changes again. We don't just think about individuals, we think about the pattern. So what might that look like? We design an unavoidable start. Not get started, but everybody writes the first line. Immediate engagement. Low threshold. We're building early success for all. Something every student can complete correctly and quickly. We use tight questioning structures. No opt-outs, but also no exposure. We scaffold responses. We model what good looks like repeatedly. We check success frequently, not at the end, but throughout. Because this class doesn't need more challenge. It needs more access to success. When belief is low, success has to be seen early. And as that builds, participation increases, confidence grows, the room changes. At the whole school level, we zoom out again, because this doesn't stop at the classroom. At the whole school level, patterns become even clearer. You might see a year group with high avoidance, a cohort with strong perfectionism, a spike in hopelessness. Now, this is no longer a teaching issue, it's a design issue. So leadership orchestration changes. We don't just say improve behavior. We ask, where are students experiencing failure repeatedly? Where is challenge not matched with appropriate support? Where are we unintentionally increasing comparison? And then we respond systematically. For example, we might review the curriculum sequencing. Are students encountering success early enough? Or are we front-loading difficulty? We might review the assessment design. Are we only valuing final outcomes? Or are we recognizing process and improvement? And if so, how? We might review CPD. Are teachers being trained to recognize these drivers or just respond to behavior? We might review quality assurance. Not just, was this a good lesson? But where did this lesson lose the room and for whom? Because now we are orchestrating at system level. If patterns are predictable, they are also preventable. So across all three levels, individual, class, whole school, the same principle holds. We are not reacting to behavior after it happens. We are designing experiences before it does. We're not just delivering lessons. We're designing success. So the question changes. Not just where might this go wrong, but for whom will this go wrong and why? That's the moment teaching becomes precise. And this is where insight becomes powerful, not as something separate from teaching, but as something that sharpens it. Because when the drivers are visible, the response becomes precise. Pause. Ask, where did it lose the room? And for whom and why? Because great teaching isn't just planned, it's orchestrated. Here we have the 10-minute orchestration check. Turn a well-planned lesson into one that actually lands. Most lessons don't fail in the planning, they fail in what happens next. This 10-minute check helps you anticipate where a lesson might lose the room, identify pressure points before they happen, adjust for how students will actually experience it. Step 1. Pressure test the plan. Before the lesson, ask, where are the pressure points? Where might students hesitate, drift, or switch off? What might feel unclear or overwhelming? Where could behavior emerge and why? Every lesson contains the seeds of its own success and its own failure. Step 2, clarity check. For each moment, ask, do students know exactly what to do first? Do they know how long they have? Do they know what it should look like, sound like? Do they know what success looks like? The key shift is clarity isn't what we say, it's what students can repeat. Step 3, orchestrate the moments. Focus on the moments where lessons are won or lost, the entry or start. Is there immediate, unavoidable task? Is there a first step that's explicit? The transition into practice. The transition into practice. Is the starting point tight and controlled? Are expectations fully clear? For guided practice, who might struggle silently? How will you spot it early? For the review, how will you secure what actually sticks? The key shift, the first 30 seconds of a task determine the next 10 minutes. For step 4, the insight layer, the difference maker. Now ask the most important question. For whom will this go wrong and why? Consider low self-efficacy. They need early success. Fear of failure. They need a low-risk entry. Avoidance need unavoidable starting points. Neurodiversity needs clarity, chunking, potentially reduced cognitive load. Same lesson, different experience, different outcome. And your final check, does this lesson create friction or remove it? We're not just delivering lessons, we're designing how they are experienced. Great teaching isn't just planned, it's orchestrated. In the next episode, I'll be joined by Joel Tennant from Against the Odds. We're going to take this thinking even further and look at what sits behind behavior when you factor in identity, adversity, and belonging. Not just how lessons land, but how life experience shapes how young people interpret what happens in the classroom. It's a powerful conversation and one I think a lot of people will recognize. Because if this episode is about how these lessons land, the next one is